The whole issue of resilience is moving so quickly that it almost changes on a daily basis. And I was in a hotel in Windsor a couple of weeks ago, and there was a sign. I was up, my wife and I were on the 18th floor, and the sign said, "In the event of fire, do not use the elevator, take the stairs." Well, we're going to have to change that sign. That sign is going to have to read in the future, "In the event of fire or rain, do not use the elevator." You may or may not be familiar with a story a couple of months ago of two individuals who almost drowned in an elevator when the basement in which they had arrived to get their car was flooded during an extremely violent and almost common phenomena these days, violent rainstorms. And they almost drowned until the police were able to arrive and pry open the doors and get them out safely. So, as I say, this is an issue that's changing virtually on a daily basis. So we're going to lead off this year, and I've got a whole bundle of people to introduce, and so if I haven't said anything about you yet, my guests, whatever, we will. There will be that moment, but I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Irvin Studin of the University of Toronto. Irvin is he's a well-known columnist on occasion in the Toronto Star. You may have seen his writings on a variety of issues, specifically around Canada's future and many of its geopolitical relations. He's been a guest visiting professor at the Universite du Quebec, Montreal. He has been a professor in leading universities in North America, Asia, and Europe. This guy gets around, and I'm a particular fan of his because he was once a professional soccer player too. So he's done a little bit of everything in his life, an impressive guy. So without further ado, and to kind of lead us into this discussion about the big picture and what you in large measure can look forward to in your future in Canada and perhaps in larger measure thinking about world that we're going to be living in, we already are living in and will be living in the future. Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Irvin Studin.
You can hear me? Oh, great. All right. Let's put this here. Thanks so much for the warm welcome, Bill. This is about the third or fourth year in a row that I'm speaking at this conference or similar conference on Bill's very generous invitation, and I always love to take him up on his offers because I think he's really one of the pioneers in an important area of thinking that I'd like to explore with you today. And congratulations to Seneca, David Agnew, and thanks to TD for supporting this important event. I really want to thank Bill for getting your attention because they said Irvin Studin, oh, he writes, he's a professor, he's a provocateur. He's a soccer player, and I saw everyone got excited about that. And the only problem was, why would you presume that I'm a former soccer player? Is it because of my constitution today? It's not impressive. But I once was a footballer, and we might bring that into the conversation today. Because actually, the state of football is completely related to some of the themes I'd like to speak to you about today. But I really want to talk about the future of Canada over the next century, okay? I was just listening to the Prime Minister of Canada on Metro Morning today, and I'm completely nonpartisan and a critic of all and a plotter of all. And I found the conversation depressing because at such a difficult time in international affairs and in Canadian history, for reasons I'll explain, the thinking and the discussion was so micro. Whereas other countries, and even us in other periods of our history, were thinking really macro about building, about the future. We really have boxed ourselves into what I call an ideological dead end, really micro issues. So I want to encourage you and maybe motivate you as young people to really make your imagination more vast. So we'll talk about the future of Canada. Let me just see whether my slides work here. Is it? Okay, good. I typically do not do this talk using slides because I rely on my good looks alone to excite the audience. But then my wife corrected me, said, "You're not as good looking as you were, you better use slides." So we'll start with slides. Do you recognize this country? Okay, most Canadians don't know their own map. Canada, please study it quickly. I make my kids read the Constitution of Canada and study its maps every evening. Okay, Canada. I would like you now to do an abstraction of Canada, and it will be very simple. It's a box, okay, which is essentially our geography. Okay? Now, what are the borders on that box? By the way, does this make sense? I know we're not all math majors, but I've abstracted from that map and I made a box of it. Okay? This is how we have our mental picture of Canada. What is the southern axis? What is that? We know that one well. What country lies there? United States, right? Okay. A. Great. When did we take care of that border in our history? Please don't say 2 weeks ago when we signed the USMCA. Okay? When did we take care of that border in our history? Anyone know? The answer is 1871. Canada is created in direct contradistinction to the American project constitutionally. If you read the Constitution of Canada, as I make my kids read it, the whole structure, the logic of it is in direct contradistinction to the American project in the 19th century, which is when the Americans were at war amongst themselves and threatened to invade. We created a faux federation, the mirage of a grand continental federation that would impress the Americans, impress the Brits, and stave off manifest destiny. We've tamed that border in 1871 with the Treaty of Washington. Ever since, we've largely migrated into the American orbit, friendly relations, but they were the natural enemy, okay? That's 1871. Canada's now 151 years old, so I want to push us into the next century. Now, as I go through these borders, through this abstraction of Canada, I want you to keep one thing in mind. How long do modern countries last? How long do modern states last? I mean, they may die for environmental reasons, as I know is some of the fear supporting this conference as this thing, but they often die through war and peace and constitutional conflict. How long? Now let's do a show of hands. Countries last 100 years. Who says 100 years? Right. Less than 100 years. Hands? More than 100 years. Okay, we're at less than 100 years. Less than 80 years? Anyone? Less than 70 years? The answer is 60 years. Countries last 60 years, after which they explode or are changed or transformed, often unrecognizably. You look at the whole Middle East today, Africa, Asian countries, look at the former Soviet space. All of those countries are less than 60 years old. I know you would say China. China must be 5,000 years old, but you're wrong. China is younger than Canada in its modern form. Okay, the People's Republic of China is quite a young country compared to Canada. So we think tomorrow is as today, and I want to commend to you today that tomorrow is not guaranteed for some of the reasons we'll discuss. Okay, I just mentioned it, but the west coast of Canada, I know I have an old friend here who just moved from the west coast. The west coast has a new border this century. What's it called? So you're not thinking about it, so I'm going to try to make you think about it. What's the sea? The sea is not the sea. The sea is not the Pacific Sea. It's what? What's the big country to our west? China. All right? Anyone been to China? Anyone been to China? Hello. All right. If you've not been to China and you're in your 20s, you must go there for a long time. To live, to work, to see what is happening. Because China is the most important country this century. Because I want to get that into your imaginations, that China is super important. I know we think that America is uber important because we're talking about America all the time, but China is the center of a lot of the economic and strategic and, by the way, environmental policy action in the world. And a lot of the solutions and problems will come from the success or failure of China. But the reason I bring up China on our West Coast is twofold. One, we are very close to China. I know you say, well, we're in Toronto, it's very far. How many people have been to British Columbia? How many people want to go to British Columbia? How many people never want to go to British Columbia? All right. Most Torontonians want to go to live in British Columbia, and we have one British Columbian, some come here, but I find the British Columbians speak very slowly. They're very relaxed. Why am I bringing British Columbia up? Because the western tip of British Columbia is a town called Prince Rupert. It is closer to China than is Canberra, Australia, the capital of Australia. And if you go north of British Columbia, what's the territory north of British Columbia? The most beautiful part of Canada, in my view. Yukon. The capital of Yukon, Whitehorse, is closer to Beijing than is Sydney, Australia. It is that close. I know we don't see it from here, but if you go there and understand the map of Canada, we don't know our own geography. We are close to China. Okay? China is not some abstraction. It is not to the east of Europe, and is not very distant from our western flank. First point. And by the way, the Australians, if you go to Australia, they think they're part of Asia. Today they say, well, we're in the Asian continent. But we're closer to China, the most important country in Asia today. So we are in Asia. I hope that's new to you, but that's uber important. The second reason I bring up China is the following. Not just our proximity, China is very close, but two, we do not know China. What do you mean you don't know China? Well, we've never had a China that's been important throughout Canadian history. Let's go to the last 151 years I mentioned. Where was China when Canada was created in 1867? Answer, China had just lost its second Opium War to Western powers, after which the Middle Kingdom went into a state of depression and chaos for about 150 years. So the period of Chinese instability, chaos, depression, what they call the Great Divergence, coincides exactly with the life of Canada. And now they're back, rich, ambitious, much more stable, we think, and very sophisticated. Okay, we can go into the political system, but by the way, on environmental policy, it's the Chinese who are leading the world. I know you'll say that, well, they're polluting the world, but actually they're very serious about the solutions too. And if they get things right because of their mass, they'll be leading the world. So China is not only close to us, it is there for the first time in our history. So it is a border we must not only know, but we must master it in a way that we did, in the same way we did the southern border from 1871. Okay? By the way, why does everyone live along the southern border? Why does everyone live along the A-axis of Canada? By the way, everyone understands, again, this is Canada, right? Okay. Why does everyone live along the A? I know we like to say, because it's warmer, right? Well, I don't know if anyone's been to Ottawa in the winter. I lived in Ottawa for 5 or 6 years, and I can tell you that John A. Macdonald was a genius. The reason he was a genius because he chose a capital that the Americans would never want to invade. Who would want to invade Ottawa? It's colder than Moscow. It is colder than Moscow. I worked in Moscow. Ottawa is colder than Moscow, with fewer good restaurants, in my humble view. Why does everyone live on the A-axis? Why does everyone? It's not warm. It's not the water. Because of money? Because the Americans are there, right? Because we want to go see a concert on Broadway? Is that why? Why do we live on the... Think back to our founding. Remember, I said we are created in juxtaposition and contradistinction to the Americans, who were the natural enemy. Why do we live there? Answer: because the Americans were going to invade from there. So all the forts were built along the A-axis. At Fort York, look at all the railway lines. They are east-west in order to move troops along our axis, or the A-axis, for defensive purposes. Now it looks like it's because of the economy, because originally it had a strategic purpose. Okay, C. That is a future strategic boundary for us that we will have to manage in a similar way. I'm not talking about war necessarily, but I'm saying we will need to manage that in a similar way, and it's a new thing. But it gets more complicated still this century because we have a second new border. Let's look northward. What is the country to our north? Let's all say it together. Russia. Okay. Usually I'm told that when I say Russia, people say, whoa, like it's a bad thing. But I want to say it's a really real thing because it's a new border for us. Why is it a new border? Well, Russia's always been there. China's new border. So if I've tried to persuade you that China is a new thing for Canada altogether, and by the way, we don't understand China. We have very naive national and public understanding of China. Russia's the same problem. Why is Russia a new border for us? Russia's also at least an old civilization, new country, old civilization. Why is it new for us as a border? What's happening to the north? There's climate change, and what's happening to the ice there? It's melting. At least seasonally, the Northwest Passage will be open in the next few decades. And there's a whole contest for seabed resources there. Now, whatever your interest in the Arctic, it might be resource-based, it might be military, it might be environmental, it might be indigenous, right? It might just be cultural. It is a whole new landscape opening up to Canada that we do not understand. And I will try to persuade you that we do not understand. And obviously, we don't understand Russia. Why is it new, though? Why is it new? What's so new about it? Well, it's new because we've never had this juxtaposition with Russia. We've never been face à face, nez à nez, mano a mano with Russia. We've always thought that Russia was to the east of E, which is our fourth border, Europe. Russia was always in our national imagination to the east of E, right? Like when you think about the Ukraine conflict, or you think about European-Russian relations, you think about Russia to the east, right? Or maybe to the north of China, or to the west of China, but not directly to our north. The Russians are not very far. They're staring right down on us. They might be in the room spying on us right now. Right? So look at this border configuration. It's much more complex than not only you think, but our own leaders think. Because our own leaders have what I call a mental map that includes mainly A and E, our historical borders. Everyone came from Europe in the modern founding. Obviously, we had a huge indigenous population. And the Americans were the natural enemy. But now we have C and R. So the strategic game for Canada this century is ACRE, acre. Okay? ACRE. What's our goal if we're going to survive this century? By the way, we're at 151 years, and if we agree that the modern state lasts 60 years, then we're way past our past due date, or our best before date. We may not survive the century, and these borders suggest a much more difficult future for Canada. I mean, these are serious borders. ACRE, these are all nuclear powers. All of them. 3 of them, at least, are great powers: America, China, and Russia. And if you put Germany in there and France together, those are really serious countries. That means we're going to have to be a serious country, too, if we're going to survive. Otherwise, we will be what I call a strategic cripple. we will be crushed, or living completely on the terms of these bigger countries who will use us as their playing field, in environmental terms, in economic terms, in intellectual terms, in scientific terms, in political terms, of course. So let's look at the population distribution in Canada, and we'll close off the discussion shortly after that, because you might know that in my past talks and a lot of my public work, I've been talking about, probably for the last 10 years, the idea of Canada requiring 100 million people by the end of the century. And our population today is 37. I don't know why a lot of older Canadians say they have this number 30 in their head. They never, every year they keep saying 30. And then people who aren't into population statistics talk about 35 all the time. Well, we're 37, and the GTA itself will approach 7 million in a couple of years. So we're pretty big. But what I want to do is, again, expand your imagination and make the case for 100 million generally being good. Now, since I talked about 100 million, a lot of support has grown for the idea, and a lot of opposition. And so we've had to develop good arguments to explain why we need 100 million. And it's very nuanced, because the counter-arguments are very rich. 100 million is everything. It's environmental policy, it's social policy, it's cultural policy, it's infrastructure. But what I don't want you to do is come back to me after I've tried to expand your imagination for the last hour and say, we can't have 100 million people, student, because the Gardiner Expressway will be very crowded. Okay? Because garbage collection in Richmond Hill will not function. Okay? I want to expand your thinking, expand the horizons. And here's how we start. Remember, we said along the A-axis is where most of the population was founded historically, along a defensive logic to begin with, and eventually a cultural and economic logic. And so, what is the population distribution? Well, we have 35 million people of 37 living along the A-axis, which is our general imagination. So when we imagine 100 million people, Studin says we have 100 million people. So that means Toronto will be, what, 30 million people by the end of the century. That's terrible. Of course it's terrible, and I'm not advocating for that. I live in Richmond Hill, so I'm talking about the garbage collection there, okay? Actually, Richmond Hill has better garbage collection than Vaughan. You could put that in there. 35 million people. So spread it, and I've seen some population projections that say, I mean, again, very linear, and along the Canadian thinking, Toronto 30 million, Montreal 12 million, Calgary, Vancouver 5-6 million, and so on. No, that will not be the configuration if we get to 100 million. For the reason of the 4-point game I commended to in the middle of the lecture, ACRE. We'll get to that. In the middle of Canada, we have about 2 million people, and very worryingly, or to use a Facebook word, troublingly, I don't know why people on Facebook, they always use the word troubling, which is the end of the debate. I find that very troubling, end of the debate. This is a very troubling thing. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize it was troubling. Okay, in the north, on the R-axis, we have 115,000 people, okay, to manage our entire northern border along the R-axis, which is the Canada-Russia border. And by the way, if you want to get advanced on this, it's more than Russia. We have an American border there with Alaska. We have some borders with Scandinavian countries. Of course, with the Scandinavians, we could take them in a war, but the Russians are more problematic. 115,000 people. Now, I do a lot of work in the Northern Territories. It is the future, I believe, of Canada, if only we realized it. And if we were a more strategic country, in the tradition of our founders who thought big and long and were builders, and not today as we do quite micro, we would understand this. But I'm trying to commend it to you for existential purposes, because 115,000 people is not enough to manage the real estate in the north. Now you'll say, well, what about climate change? Especially given climate change. If you have an environmental agenda and you have 115,000 people across a territory that is continent-sized, That's a drop in the bucket. Let me make it even more troubling for you. Of the 115,000 people, how many actually think north? I would say 1%. 1 out of every 100 people in Yukon, NWT, and Nunavut thinks about the northern border. The rest of them are southerners by psychology. They are looking down at Vancouver, saying, oh, wouldn't it be nice to live in Vancouver in wintertime? Or they're thinking about Ottawa or Toronto or Edmonton or Calgary. And that, by the way, is where the transport links are. I do a lot of work in Whitehorse. There are no direct flights between Toronto and Whitehorse, and there are very few flights between Whitehorse and other northern parts of Canada. Most of it is north-south. Vancouver, Whitehorse, Ottawa, Whitehorse, Edmonton, Calgary, Whitehorse. Victoria, Whitehorse now. So 1% of 115,000 is not enough to deal with our new map R. What happens, by the way, on our side? Let's go look down on Canada from the R side. From the Russian side, they have million people cities there. Irkutsk, Norilsk, Arkhangelsk. If you want to go a little bit down, the Siberian territories, million people cities that have been thinking about the North for a long time with infrastructure and a culture and a scientific military infrastructure. And we're just getting going. And by the way, in Ottawa, where I used to work, we used to tend to think that the Northerners have the northern border covered. The Northerners are thinking about it. The people in the South think that the North think, well, the North is thinking about the South. So we're talking to one another in abstraction of reality. So to 100 million, and I'll leave you with this. We need 100 million people for a host of reasons, and the net ledger will be favorable in 100 million. I can even make the case in environmental terms. Certainly in sporting terms. Talked about soccer. We would have proper soccer leagues, right? I could go back and actually put the boots on and have a team to play for, right? And my father would be happy because he said, Irvin, you're a professor? I thought you'd be a soccer player, right? We're going to need a northern immigration strategy. So please do not think about the South as the future of immigration. Everyone's going to move to Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. Well, where was Toronto 100 years ago? Toronto was by far the inferior of Montreal. Vancouver was a village, and the most important city west of Winnipeg was Dawson City, Yukon, as a function of the gold rush. So tomorrow is not as today. There will be important cities in the north of the country if we're going to survive. And I would add that they will be in the northwest of the country because of the China factor. So a lot of the axis of economic and demographic activity will have to be north and northwest, which is why Yukon, NWT, British Columbia, Alberta could be the future strategically if we're going to survive. Right? So think about big cities in the north. We don't even know what their names are. Okay? And Toronto could be smaller than some of these. Now, within the 100 million vision, and we could talk about it in the question and answer, there are all sorts of provisos. Like how many people should Quebec have? Quebec always has to have a constant proportion of the population if it's going to stay part of the Federation. What about the Indigenous population? What about majority-minority dynamics? Right? And then what about how are we actually going to do this? How are we going to distribute the population? I mean distribute in a very robust sense. I know people say incentivize, but we're going to have to be much more serious if we're going to catch up on the big retard that we are suffering from today. So 100 million, we talk about some of the nuances of that argument. I want to congratulate Bill and his team for their third book on 100 million Canadians. I think they are the most prolific writers on the topic, and hats off to you. I profit also from reading that. So a little bit about, let's discuss the next 80 years in question answer, if we make it. And then, of course, I was going to put another thing saying, yes, we can make it, but that's American. Okay. Okay, over to you. Thank you very much.
not troubling, okay? So, no, we'll even accept troubling. Commentary. How do we deal with the French language reality of Canada?
Well, let's start with the French thing. Here's something troubling. We don't know our own country. Even the proponents of 100 million, and I've been beating this drum for a long time, think that we can just populate the country willy-nilly and that everything will be okay because we're in Canada. Everything tends to be okay. And by the way, we do assimilate and absorb extremely well. You can ask me why I think that is so, but Canada does a good job. But there are structural realities to Canada, and if you're a young person, you do not yet know not only the amazing country, but how complex and big this country is. You really have to see it from a structural perspective. The problem is if you flood the country with people wherever they may come from, there is a bargain at the core of Canada, it has constitutional quality almost. It is that Quebec will maintain a general constancy in this proportion of the population. So about 20%. You can look at specific accords between the federal government and Canada, but that's the general understanding. So when I talk about 100 million Canadians, by the way, even in environmental terms, 100 million is a favorable thing for Canada. We could talk about that. But when I talk to Quebecers, they say, "Student, tu veux nous noyer?" You want to drown us. And they are right to think that. I don't want to drown them. I'm aware of the counter-argument. Why do they say it? Because at the core of Canada is an understanding that the French population and politically within Quebec will be preserved. That's the deal. Okay, if we don't understand it in Canada, we don't understand Canada. If we don't understand it in Toronto, we don't understand Canada. So we need to get that through our heads, especially in English Canada. Now, English Canada, I do not mean that we're all Anglo-Saxon, says the Russian Jewish guy. Okay, we're not Anglo-Saxon, we're in English Canada. So the proportion of the population should be constant in Quebec. How do we do that with 100 million? Well, two ideas. One is that Quebec will have its fair share. So Montreal cannot be 12 million. Or Quebec cannot be 12 or 15 million in a Canada of 100 million. It must be about 20 million. And by the way, given the size of Quebec, that's completely realistic. So no problem there. Second, we're going to look at source countries, right? Countries that can provide French-speaking immigrants. And most importantly, we're going to all start speaking French. Why do I say that? That's to the good anyways, but if we're all speaking French across the country as a second language or a first language, then we have internal mobility across the federal. You can just go work in Quebec easily, and then they'll get their 20 million, or maybe even more, without a blinking. And so that goes to what I call a national languages strategy that we need in Canada anyways, just to manage our own borders. So that's the Quebec question. Dan Zients.
Professor Studin, hello. Thank you for making your way to Seneca today and sharing your knowledge and wisdom. A question for you that sort of veers between the present and the future. As we speak, we're seeing this populist rise. In yesterday's municipal election, we saw a pretty openly xenophobic candidate get 20,000 votes in the city of Toronto running for mayor. As we see sort of that populist rise and tide across the Western world and Western democracies, how does that fit into your projections looking forward? I think it's tied into your question of, are we going to make it too? How does that fit in? How could we possibly embrace hundreds of thousands, millions of newcomers to Canada when there are people still grappling with the notions of the immigrants that we're accepting to date, even though, again, all the evidence points to them being sort of the reasons for the success economically of this country and on a whole other bunch of different levels as well. Loaded question for you this morning.
Thanks, Don. It's a great question, and it's one that I've been grappling with for the last 10 years. And by the way, I don't do any, you asked about the present and the future. I don't do the present at all. I'm in the future. Forget about the present. I'm just kidding. It is such a central question, and a couple of things just to surprise you. The candidate in question is Faith Goldie, right? She was the third candidate. Now, Faith was once my student. at the University of Toronto. She used to sit front row in international law lecture that I gave, right up front. And by the way, a very good student, very keen. I did not know her views. She just asked a lot of questions. So it's been an interesting evolution. Second point is this. A few years ago, I gave this same lecture, although it's much better this year. That one had troubling aspects. And I said, watch out, because in 100 million, there'll be a backlash. And I was referring exactly to that phenomenon. Say, watch out. Not everyone is in Toronto or from Toronto and thinks like Toronto. So travel a little bit outside of Toronto. Not just to the big cities, travel to the north even. Yukon has 37,000 people for a territory the size of France. 37, and they think they're full. Yeah, that's it. Maybe we'll get to 50,000 in a couple of decades, but that's it. So the insider-outsider phenomenon is very human, and it's in Canada too. So even proponents of 100 million ought not to think that there won't be resistance. There's a proper resistance because, and I say this as a member of a minority, so a Jewish guy is a member of the minority, that the majority will never allow itself to be upended. And I think that's perfectly right. So we need to, majority-minority dynamics, as with the Quebec question, need to be part of the equation set for 100 million and need to be managed very, very carefully. Otherwise, we'll be ahistorical, foolish, and other countries understand that very well. We just had it very good in this short period in Canada in majority-minority dynamics to not understand our own history in that respect. So to answer your question, Dan, with great care, right? And not presume that diversity on its own is without qualification enough. It has to be very, very carefully choreographed. So 100 million is a choreography planning exercise.
Yeah, Irvin, fantastic opening, and I'm cheating a bit because I'm going to
Hey, John.
talk this afternoon. I'm actually going to start from where you just finished. But I think there's another dimension of the 115,000 and the whole which you raised, but the really important thing is how we perceive of the North.
Yeah.
And we perceive it as a poverty belt.
Yeah.
We perceive it as something we have to subsidize. We have to look after people. We have to get radar detection up there. We have to. But what I think is interesting, and I think you've the same experience, if you go to Russia or Norway or any of the other countries, Greenland, Iceland, these are all in the same situation. They all have absolutely universal access to the website. Do we have that? No.
Yeah.
They have roads. They have those airplanes fly. I went to Iceland in 1970 for the first time, and they had a $99 flight to every airport in Iceland I could fly to as a tourist. We have zip.
Yeah.
Russia has 6 ports waiting for the Northwest Passage to open. Norway has 4. We have about a half in some place called Churchill, which we're all struggling to get roads and infrastructure to. In fact, we sold it to Americans who hung on to it for 15 years and let it deteriorate, and now First Nations are picking it up and reconnecting it. So I think it's also a whole perceptual, really critical perceptual role of we dismiss it as being uneconomic, and yet it's exactly the opposite. So it's really just a comment that I've experienced. And you know, I'm working, just as an example, with the Kikatalik Corporation. So they are the First Nation of Nunavut, the indigenous nation that runs Baffin Island. And our whole plan for and the economic development plan for Baffin Island is actually about 80% based on Iceland, which has 300,000 people, great football team, by the way, on top of that, but 300,000 people who live just like in a Newfoundland situation that's thriving economically. They're all connected. Every town has a rock group. Every town has a public bath. They have 600,000 people going there just to see the North, and yet we can't, fix the bridge on the railway to Port Churchill, even. So,
John, that's great, and thank you for just enhancing that line of thinking, and I'm looking forward to your own talk, we do not know our country. And I confess, having grown up in Toronto, I had a good education, great parents, and similar circumstances to y'all. But I did not start to know the country until my professional years, and I still learn a lot, obviously, but I've traveled everywhere, so it is huge, first of all. And do not presume that Toronto repeats itself elsewhere. Deliberately travel to those parts of Canada that you know least and that maybe with which you're probably least comfortable. And the North is probably the one that will amaze you most. First of all, it's huge. Secondly, Yukon in particular I find to be the most beautiful part on Earth. It's incredible. And yet, even in Yukon, and this is to your point, John, the thinking is very small. The expanses are huge. The thinking is very, very micro. In some sense, it's very Canadian. It's as the Prime Minister sounded today on Metro Morning. Now, can we, over the next 20 years, think about 2 more subway stops up to Richmond Hill, where I live? Wouldn't it be great? The Chinese, go back to the C vector that we were talking about, have built high-speed rail over the last 10 or 15 years to cover most of the populated sectors of the country. High-speed rail everywhere. Do not come to me and say it's because they have an authoritarian system. And that is not a good counter-argument. They are building, and by the way, in environmental policy, they're excelling us. In education policy and healthcare, they are trying to excel us. And the same thing in commercial policy. We have to find a way to make it work within our democratic context. We need to find a way, even though we have 4-year electoral cycles federally, weak municipalities, and still we need to find a way to expand the thinking within our constitutional construct. And the North is part of that. So the thinking must be bigger. And I think that should come before the existential crisis that will come if these 4 powers, these 4 gravitational pulls, crush us or pull us apart. And by the way, I'll have some pieces out soon about the new trade agreement that we have in the United States. It's a step 20 years back because we're being pulled in this gravitational pull with no resistance, right? And wait till the other ones start to pull. Wait till you have a conflict with Russia all of a sudden, you think Russia's to the east of Europe, and then all of a sudden you lose part of your north. Or wait till United States and China have a conflict, and then you're stuck in between, and you've not even thought about that axis, because you think everything happens along the Buffalo-Niagara border. We need to have a proper mental map. We need to be well-traveled, and we need to think long-term. And then we need to get lucky, because luck is also part of the composition of the future. Thanks, John.
It's intriguing. You got on a plane in Ottawa and fly to Iqaluit, and it's about a 3-hour there.
Yeah.
And you're actually only about halfway up Canada, even at that point.
Yeah.
You fly 3 hours south, you're probably in Havana or pretty close to it. That's how we need to think.
Yeah.
You had a question, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
I completely agree with what you're saying. Canada, although I'm very young in the country, but Canada should grow. And 100 million, it's a lot of growth due to where Canada is right now. But compared to the borders that you were mentioning, it still will be a very small number. My point is, let's per se that everybody is on the boat to do it, and everybody is up for it. How are you going to convince all the new immigrants to go to such a harsh condition, climate, and all of those new challenges? For example, what is it going to be like the Wild West in the United States back in the days, where you take carriages and get your land? Also, there is a big discussion that what you were sort of mentioning before, because you were saying that Canada is not all of Canadians. There are a lot of properties and there are a lot of lands and there is a lot of infrastructure already owned by neighbors of the South. So how are you going to deal with that? I mean, a big chunk of the infrastructure or the lands are already being owned by Southern companies.
Which infrastructure is owned by the South?
Well, for start, oil.
You mean commercial properties?
Yeah.
Okay.
and commercial lands
Yeah.
and things like
Yeah.
that. So,
Yeah.
so,
Okay.
so
Let me take the first one up in earnest and then touch on the second one. The first one is, how are we going to convince people to, not just to move to Canada? Well, I think most people would be happy to move to Canada, although I do think we could do even better on some of the quality, in the sense that we could be much more deliberate around the world in getting what I call term-setting people in different sectors, because that's part of changing the mindset. I'll give you the example in soccer, by the way. What's the problem in Canadian soccer? Any soccer players here? Anyone heard of Ronaldo? You heard of Ronaldo, but you never heard of my own soccer career? Okay. The way to change soccer here is to have a league, but also to bring real pros who can change the mentality of the soccer community. And that can happen very quickly. Just as you bring Canadians abroad to teach them how to play hockey. And you need that in different sectors where we're not a term setting, a leading people. And that is in many, many sectors, including the commercial sector. So to your second point, business people who become Canadians who are term setters, we can pick these people off around the world, and they would be happy to come. How do we get them to the north? Well, first of all, I think we gravely underestimate the appetite of people who are ambitious, hungry, opportunity-seeking, and grateful to come to Canada. We underestimate their willingness to go to the north. A lot of the people in Yukon and Northwest Territories are highly educated and from countries that don't have warm climate. And they make an opportunity and a living for themselves by virtue of that differential advantage. Mexicans, Filipinos, Senegalese, Sudanese, Mediterranean people, no problem. So I don't think it's a cold climate. It is the nature of the society and the nature of the offer and opportunity. And that is the same thing when we populated Canada. Except we need to do it not in a wild way. We need to do it very deliberately as a national priority. Because again, you don't want to wait till there's a national emergency and you don't have people there. Okay? For a young person, though, to know there are things happening up there. So in Yukon is, for instance, going online with its first university in 2 years' time. Yukon University will be the first bona fide university in the north. Nobody knows about it. And Yukoners themselves, because they're still small in their thinking, don't realize how important the opportunity is. It's huge. But we ought, in principle, we should have 20 or 30 universities in the north. Thinking about the north in the future, you need people there. So I've written a lot about northern immigration strategy and how that would look. And we'd imagine big cities there before long. Now, just one counter argument. You might say, well, what about the environmental footprint? You can't have people because that's carbon emitting or that's bad for the environment. And I would say the ledger is favorable for more people in two senses, maybe even three. One, will have better densities in most cases to allow for the services that are much more costly in environmental terms and in financial terms today because of our low density. Starting with high-speed rail, but whatever it is, the transport system of the day later in the 21st century. We would have better innovation environmentally, which is the Chinese approach, if we had more people. We'd have more competition, more money, more venture capital, better universities, more scientists working on this all the time, and term-setting people. That doesn't come with 37 million, that comes with 50 million, 60 million people, a good chunk of which are thinking about the environment. And the final thing is, we would be what I call a term-setting people in international affairs. When you negotiate climate treaties, when you negotiate environmental treaties, when you push your cause, you'd have more people to support it. And you'd be able to actually set the logic of the international treaties rather than be the taker from bigger countries like the United States, China, Russia, Europe. So that's a different way of thinking about the environmental counter-argument. By the way, which I don't think is the main counter-argument to 100 million. Bill.
Thank you, Irvin. Thank you, Irvin. That was brilliant. We always enjoy your participation with us. Before we go to a break, however, I want to call up Andrew Wickham. And Andrew, if you could bring some copies of our latest endeavor in this particular thinking. We have some of the authors of the just released, literally off the presses, 100 Million Canadians, the third annual edition of Thinking on this topic. It deals with remote, rural, and protected areas. Do we have the authors with us today? Do we have?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Most of them are international.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So they went home to their own countries to think about Canada with 100 million. So we want to present Irvin with copies of the books. This is our thinking on this subject. It really revolves around how we as kind of at this level, within the college environment, within our thinking, within our student body, are thinking about these bigger issues as well. So more reading material.
Thank you, and
Irvin.
congratulations, Bill. And sincerely, I do think that Bill and his team are some of the key pioneers in Canada on pushing this topic, which, by the way, is a topic that's easy to resist because 100 million is everything. But you need someone to stubbornly push. And I calculate, if I calculate that modern states last 60 years, I calculate that in the Canadian political psychology, it takes 5 years for an idea to become from peripheral to, yeah, of course, it's obviously right? So it becomes consensual, and the 100 million is within that spectrum. So you're doing yeoman's work, and congratulations, Bill.
Thank you, thank you. I'm gonna call up a former trainee of yours. You were once, we understand, Irvin, a soccer coach, and I'm gonna call upon one of your former trainees to say thank you on behalf of Seneca College, TD Insurance, and others. Dan Zantz. Dan, come on down.
So a number of former soccer students in the crowd. So.
Yeah,
Dan?
actually, yeah, just very quickly, actually Seneca is the winningest college in OCAA history. That's
Awesome.
the Ontario Colleges Athletic Association. We have our student athletes are among the best in the province. But yes, I'm bringing you thanks. A great way to kick off our Resilience Symposium. Again, these are sort of correlated issues, how we remain resilient economically and on matters of climate change as well, and your very innovative and insightful research. So thank you on behalf of Seneca and on behalf of TD.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.